Hello, my dear friends. You think royal women only get to bathe in golden cocoons and enjoy a life of luxury. In fact, they have to fight with all kinds of horrifying habits right in the Forbidden Palace. Not aromatherapy spas, but bathing in dirty, muddy water, applying mouse fat to their hair, applying goat placenta masks, and using pillows soaked in chicken blood to ward off nightmares. Each seemingly luxurious ritual hides pain and shame that they dare not reveal. Tonight, we will expose the horrifying hygiene habits of ancient Chinese royal women. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If you ever thought that royal women in ancient China were chosen purely for their beauty or grace, the truth might surprise you. Inside the Imperial palace, behind carved doors and layers of embroidered curtains, a woman's future could be determined by something as raw as the smell of her body. It often was. When girls were brought to the palace as potential concubines, they were not expected to speak or sing or demonstrate any skill. They were simply lined up, motionless, heads down, while the emperor passed by. The only thing that spoke was their scent. It was not a perfume or a floral powder. The emperor wanted something real, unfiltered. It was believed that a woman's natural body odour revealed her inner essence. That included the way her skin reacted after days without bathing, the way her sweat settled into her clothing, and the lingering trace of her on the air. The more unique and natural the smell, the more likely she was to be remembered. Some women were instructed by older palace maids not to bathe for at least 3 days before an appearance. Others went longer, hoping the lack of soap would work in their favour. In this silent competition, each scent became a signature. Some women's skin gave off a soft musk, others something faintly sour, or dry and warm like sun-heated linen. To modern people, it might seem unpleasant, but in that world, it was vital. The emperor didn't just pick a woman to lie beside him. He picked one whose body would leave a mark on his memory, on his robes, on the sheets. That meant odour had power. Some women went so far as to eat specific herbs daily to influence how they smelled. Orange peel, fennel, and chrysanthemum tea were common. Garlic and red meat were avoided. Attendants had to be careful, too. If a servant brought in a towel that smelled too floral, the concubine could be accused of cheating. If her scent reminded the emperor of something too ordinary or too strong, she might never be called again. Some women were dismissed from favour not because they said the wrong thing, but because they smelled too clean. Scent became identity, and identity became strategy. The older concubines knew this. They trained the younger ones how to sweat slowly, how to air out their robes without losing the essential warmth of their bodies, how to choose fabrics that allowed odour to rise just enough. Washing was allowed, of course, but done cautiously. Women did not soak or scrub their entire bodies before special events. They would rinse their hands, their faces, and sometimes their feet. But the torso and underarms were often left untouched. They were preserved, in a way, covered carefully, wrapped in layers of silk or hemp cloth, kept warm to encourage a light moisture that would bring the scent to the surface. Bathing too close to an imperial banquet was considered foolish. It washed away your chances. Their underclothes reflected this. Instead of fresh garments each day, many wore the same inner layer for several days at a time. These pieces were thin and absorbent, chosen not for comfort but for their ability to carry the body's scent. After being worn, they were not immediately washed. They were folded, stored in wooden drawers lined with dried herbs, and worn again later when needed. This was not laziness. It was deliberate. The smell was being maintained like a perfume bottle never opened, but always ready. It's strange to think that in a world obsessed with control, so much was left up to how a woman naturally smelled. She could not change her family name, her appearance, or her position in the hierarchy, but she could alter how long she went without washing, what she ate, what herbs she used, and how she dried her clothes. These tiny decisions could lead to a night with the Emperor or a life of being forgotten. The Emperor himself rarely spoke during these selections. He simply walked past each woman, pausing slightly if a scent caught his attention. It was subtle, but subtlety carried weight. A wrinkle of his nose or a glance toward a maid could change everything. If a woman's scent was favoured, she was brought forward. If not, she remained in the background, perhaps forever. No reason was given, but among the women, they knew. They whispered later, alone in their quarters. It was the smell. Compared to today, where entire industries revolve around removing odour, these women were praised for cultivating it. Sweat was not something to be wiped away. It was part of who they were. In the dark halls of the palace, it was how they were remembered. There were cases where women's bodies reacted differently over time. Some developed strong, bitter odours as they aged or changed diets. They were sometimes prescribed special teas or told to lie in sun-warmed sheets to dry out the scent. Others had their chambers moved closer to the herb storeroom so that the air might carry something more pleasing. It was a constant adjustment, a game without rules, and yet everyone played. I imagine it must have been exhausting, to be watched not for your voice or your skill, but for how your body aged, how it reacted to heat and clothing and diet, not even allowed to wear perfume, just your sweat, wrapped in silk and silence. It makes you wonder how much of these women's lives were spent not living, but calculating the perfect moment to smell right. That detail alone sets the tone for everything that follows in their world. These weren't just hygiene habits, they were tools of survival, and while the scent was the first test, it was far from the last. In the next part, we'll descend into the wooden bathhouses where dozens of royal women soaked in the same murky water, one after another, hoping not to be the last. After all the calculation and control involved in managing their scent, royal women still had to face another part of life in the palace that felt far less delicate. Bathing, though symbolic of refinement and purity, often happened in conditions that were anything but clean. There were bathhouses inside the inner quarters, but the practice itself revealed more about rank and scarcity than about hygiene. The bathhouse for women of the harem usually held a large wooden tub placed at the centre of the room. The walls were made of stone or packed clay, cool and slightly damp, with wooden rafters above that caught the scent of steam and skin. The tub was deep enough for a person to sit inside with water reaching the chest, and wide enough to allow a pair of servants to assist without crowding. It was filled with heated water brought in using buckets from the main kitchens or boiled in cauldrons nearby. There was no plumbing. Every drop had to be carried in. Women bathed in order of status. The highest-ranking concubine would enter first. She would have fresh, hot water, soft cloths, and sometimes a handful of flower petals sprinkled across the surface. She would sit quietly while two attendants gently poured water over her shoulders, washed her hair with rice water or herbal mixtures, and helped her scrub the more delicate parts of her body with woven cloth. Her session would last up to half an hour. When she was done, she would be wrapped in warm towels and led out through a different exit. Then, without draining the tub, the next woman would step in. She was usually of a lower rank. The same water, now faintly cloudy, was reheated by ladling fresh hot water into the top. Her attendants were fewer, her clothes reused, and any flowers had long sunk to the bottom. She sat in the same water where the first woman had sweated, where her skin had been scrubbed, where traces of her body floated unseen. And so it continued, with each woman stepping into the same bath, each time with slightly murkier water. By the time the 10th or 12th woman sat down, she might as well have been soaking in someone else's soup. There was no draining between turns. That was wasteful, especially when fuel for heating and labour for carrying were limited. If the water still smelled faintly of herbs or did not visibly reek, it was considered acceptable. Of course, the women had no say in the matter. Even the more refined concubines knew better than to complain. No soap was used, only herbal infusions, ground rice powder, or, in some cases, fermented bean water. These were meant to soften skin or neutralize odour, not to sanitize. Dead skin, hair, and oil would accumulate on the surface of the water by the middle of the day. The bath attendants would skim off the worst of it using a ladle or a square cloth, but much of it remained. The room became humid, warm, and heavy with the smell of flesh, damp cloth, and cooling tea left on the corners for the servants. There were no partitions. Women sat naked or partially covered by towels in full view of each other, yet barely spoke. It was not a place of comfort or relaxation. It was a chore, a requirement. To skip one's turn was to risk rumours of illness, disobedience, or worse. Once the final group of women had bathed, the water was finally drained using a large bucket, carried out in sections. The tub would be rinsed roughly with cold water, and a new batch would be prepared for the next day. Today, we expect spa treatments and personal showers, but for royal women back then, the bath was closer to a communal basin for livestock. Their experience was shaped entirely by their position. Cleanliness was not a right. It was a privilege, rationed according to who mattered most. Servants had their rotation, and were often forbidden from using the same tub. They washed with leftover water behind the bathhouse, without privacy, usually at night. They handled the task of cleaning the tub, wringing out the rags, and drying the towels, many of which were stained, frayed, or barely dry before the next use. Those who complained were replaced. Those who kept quiet worked with their sleeves rolled high and their eyes lowered. I often wonder what it felt like for the younger women, newly arrived, full of nerves and hope, stepping into water already used by 10 others. It must have been both humiliating and numbing. But then again, this was the palace. You weren't expected to feel clean. You were expected to appear clean, especially under candlelight and ceremonial robes. There's something deeply uncomfortable about pretending to be pure while soaking in someone else's filth. The fabric of daily life in the harem was soaked, quite literally, in layers of other people's presence. Whether it was scent, fabric, food, or water, nothing belonged to one person entirely. Even the act of washing your own body had to follow a script handed down by rank and routine. No one questioned the order. No one dared to ask for fresher water or a separate towel. It would be too easy to assume that bathing in dirty water was the lowest point of their hygiene. In truth, it was just the surface. What lingered below was even less visible, even more disturbing, and just as accepted. As the water drained slowly through the cracks in the bathhouse floor, something else settled in the walls and in the skin. There were things they did after the bath that made the experience even stranger. And if the body had already soaked in what others left behind, the next step was to hide what the body still produced. Once the women of the harem finished their rotation through the shared bath water, there was still one more ritual some of them followed before the day could truly begin. It didn't involve rose oil or scented powder. It wasn't a silk robe or a jade comb. What followed was not discussed publicly, not even among themselves, but it existed, and in the higher chambers of the inner palace, it was considered both effective and essential. On a small wooden tray, laid with folded cloth, sat a porcelain cup filled with fresh, still warm urine. The source mattered. Not just any urine would do. It had to come from a child under the age of 10, preferably male, and preferably healthy. Early morning samples were considered the most potent. That meant some palace maids were assigned, every morning before the sun had fully risen, to collect the first urine passed by selected children. These children were not always aware of their participation. They simply relieved themselves as instructed. The containers, usually small bowls or fine teacups, were covered with linen and carried quickly to the private quarters of favoured consorts. Once there, The liquid would be poured into a shallow ceramic dish and left to cool slightly. It wasn't used immediately. Instead, it was mixed with finely ground pearl powder, sometimes ginseng or crushed chrysanthemum petals. The result was a milky substance that dried to a film. With slow, familiar strokes, the concubine or her attendant would spread the mixture across the face, especially the cheeks, forehead, and under the eyes. It was left on for hours, often overnight. They believed it brightened the skin, reduced spots, and softened fine lines. It was the Imperial version of a modern sheet mask, just with ingredients most people today wouldn't keep in their bathroom. In some ways, the logic was simple. Urine was warm, sterile, and contained compounds that softened the skin. But the real reason it was so valued had more to do with superstition and the obsession with youthful energy. Children were seen as pure vessels of life. Their waste, it was said, still carried the lightness of untouched chi. The higher a woman's status, the more access she had to these bizarre luxuries. Some consorts had several jars delivered each week, already mixed and labelled. Others preferred it freshly prepared. The pearl powder came from coastal regions, often smuggled into the court at great expense. Maids were trained to stir the mixture slowly, always in one direction, never letting it clump. The mask dried on the skin like a second face. When it cracked, it left faint white lines on the bedding. They called it beauty, but to anyone outside the palace, it must have smelled like a neglected hospital. It wasn't supposed to be pleasant. It was supposed to work. In the morning, they would wipe it off with steamed cloths, often without rinsing fully. The residue was believed to protect the skin throughout the day, creating a barrier against sun, wind, and dryness. The jars were then washed and returned. Nothing was wasted. The clothes used were rinsed, dried, and hung discreetly behind curtains. Even the bowls used to collect the urine were handled with care, marked to indicate which child had filled them. Some concubines were particular. They believed one child's urine worked better than another's. Attendants had to remember names and times, rotating the collection based on who was available, healthy, or particularly favoured that week. It wasn't something one could refuse. A maid who spilled a jar or brought the wrong sample could lose her post. In rare cases, she might even be accused of sabotage. There was always quiet pressure to keep the routine intact. No one explained why. It was simply the way things were done. And even then, this was only one of the substances royal women applied to their faces. Bird droppings, snail slime, crushed insects. All of them had their place in the silent pursuit of eternal youth. The palace air was dry in winter, heavy in summer, and filled with smoke from incense and oil lamps. Skin aged fast. Lines formed at the edges of the eyes, near the lips, and around the neck. Each one was a threat, something to be erased, if not with jade rollers, then with something stronger. It's strange, looking back, how women were expected to look untouched while constantly touching themselves with things no one dared name aloud. The more respected they were, the more pressure they carried to remain soft, white, and glowing. It didn't matter if that glow came from powder, sweat, or the filtered waste of a child. Results mattered more than comfort. I can almost picture it. A cold stone floor under bare feet, a pale face shining in the dark, layered with a drying mask that pulled the skin tight. A maid silently folds the cloths beside a lacquered box of pearl powder, pretending not to notice the smell. Everything is quiet, everything proper, yet nothing about it felt clean. The strange thing is how normal it must have become. After a while, the ingredients lost their meaning. It was just a part of the evening routine. Lay out the robes, or comb the hair, apply the mask, blow out the lamp, and somewhere in all that, a woman who used to laugh freely as a girl now sat perfectly still, letting her face go dry and stiff while her thoughts wandered far from the palace walls. The palace had many rules, but none of them questioned whether a woman should smear herself with a child's urine. That wasn't considered odd. It was tradition. And in the imperial court, Tradition had a way of making even the grotesque feel respectable. There were worse treatments, still, ones that came not from children but from dead things, from fluids stored too long, from substances scraped from the body and put right back onto the skin. Once the face had been coated with layers of strange mixtures and the jars had been emptied and cleaned, the day was still not over for the women of the inner court. There remained one more habit, hidden beneath every embroidered robe and every silken sleeve, never spoken of directly but always present. It clung to the body day after day, week after week, and it smelled like something forgotten. Underwear, though rarely mentioned in historical documents, was an intimate part of daily life for royal women. It was also one of the least cared for items in terms of hygiene. Unlike outer garments, which were often changed depending on the event, the weather, or the presence of the emperor, the inner layers remained the same for days or even weeks at a time. The reason was not laziness, it was fear. There was a strong belief in many dynasties that the female reproductive area was especially sensitive to cold. Exposure to cool air or damp fabric was thought to cause illness, weakness, or even infertility. To prevent this, women were encouraged to wear thick, padded underwear made from layers of cotton, hemp, or silk. Once these garments were put on, they were not removed unless absolutely necessary, and even then, it was done quietly, cautiously, and only during certain hours. During menstruation, the situation became even more complicated. There were no disposable pads or modern hygiene products. Blood was absorbed using a thick cloth folded into multiple layers, placed between the body and the underwear. These clothes were not changed often. Sometimes they were kept in place for an entire day. The combination of blood, sweat, and other bodily fluids soaked through the fabric and stayed there, sealed beneath the robes, creating a persistent dampness that caused itching and discomfort. At that point, it wasn't underwear anymore. It was a slow-cooking recipe for infection. But again, comfort was not the priority. Warmth was. There was always the fear that if the underlayer was removed too often or washed in cold water, it would lead to imbalances in the body. Women who fell ill during their cycles were often blamed for not protecting their root. For this reason, underwear was washed in secret. It could not be hung in the open like outer garments. The sight of blood-stained cloth or underlayers was considered deeply inappropriate, even shameful, so it was done at night. Some women washed their underthings by candlelight, crouched beside a shallow basin with warm water carried in by a trusted maid. Others gave the task to attendants, with strict instructions not to tell anyone or let anything drip. The washing process was quick. There were no harsh soaps, only warm water mixed with rice husk or tea leaves, believed to absorb odour. The cloth was rubbed between the hands, then pressed dry in layers of linen. It was hung inside cupboards or behind partitions, never outside. It often remained damp for the next use. If today's luxury lingerie brands saw these conditions, they'd probably faint from horror. There was no rotation system. Many women had only one or two pairs. The fabric grew stiff over time, and sometimes stained permanently. In summer, the smell became stronger. In winter, the wet cloth froze into shape if left near open windows. It clung to the body like a second skin, unwanted but necessary. No one dared to bring it up. Not to the eunuchs, not to the physician, and certainly not to each other. Discussions about bodily discomfort were considered low and improper. A concubine could be known for her embroidery, her singing, her scent, or her laughter, but never for her rash or her itching. Those problems were hidden beneath politeness, just like the garments themselves. I imagine it must have been a quiet misery. To walk through polished halls, back straight, lips powdered, eyes lowered, while under all those layers, your skin burned. There's a kind of loneliness in being forced to endure pain you can't even name aloud. Not even your closest attendant was allowed to speak of it. They simply handed you a warmed cloth at night and turned away as you used it. Some women developed infections. The records do not say so explicitly, but the symptoms are clear. A sudden decline in health, unexplained fevers, a request to see the Imperial physician, followed by reassignment to distant quarters. The phrase "no longer summoned" appears frequently in palace logs. What began as a patch of damp fabric led, silently, to social death. Over time, a few tried to improve their routines. They stitched small packets of crushed herbs into the lining of their underwear, hoping to mask the odour or reduce irritation. They warmed the fabric by the fire before putting it on. They rubbed crushed camphor onto their thighs. Some even requested private steam sessions, sitting over herbal pots hidden behind folding screens. But none of these practices were widespread. They were seen as indulgent or suspicious. Most women simply endured. Modern hygiene gives us options, routines, products. Those women had only silence, and the expectation to remain still. The knowledge that removing your undergarments too soon could mean disgrace. That washing it too openly could cost you status. That asking for help might make you unclean in the eyes of others. It is difficult to reconcile the image of luxury often associated with imperial women and the quiet filth they carried beneath their robes. But the palace was like that, beautiful on the outside, unspoken rot underneath. And nowhere was that more literal than in the layers of clothing that were never washed enough. What came next was no better. If the underwear could not be changed often, then the bedding, which absorbed even more, was treated with even less care. If the undergarments of royal women remained unchanged for weeks, what lay beneath them was even more carefully protected, though not in the way one might expect. Hygiene, as we understand it today, was not the standard in the palace. Cleanliness did not always mean washing. It often meant restraint. And when it came to the most private part of a woman's body, that restraint became a rule. There was a widespread belief that water, especially cold or flowing water, could damage a woman's internal balance. The female body was considered inherently soft, yielding, and vulnerable to outside influence. Washing the genital area too often or too thoroughly was thought to draw out energy, causing fatigue, emotional imbalance, and even infertility. This fear of losing vital essence shaped not only how women cared for themselves, but how they were taught to understand their bodies. Most women in the imperial harem were discouraged from washing that part of the body with water at all. They were allowed to dab gently with dry cloths, sometimes warmed near a lantern or a brazier. No rubbing, no scrubbing, no soap, just a light touch to absorb moisture. In summer, this left many feeling constantly damp. In winter, the clothes became stiff and cold. There was discomfort either way, but no other method was permitted. It's hard to believe that a palace with gold-plated furniture wouldn't allow water near a woman's own body, but that was the logic. Water was dangerous. The area was sacred, and touching it too much could disrupt the delicate balance of yin and yang that supposedly governed female health. Instead of washing, the women were told to preserve, to avoid contact, to let the area rest. If discomfort occurred, they were advised not to bathe, but to wait for one of the rare cleansing sessions arranged by the medical women of the court. These were not regular, often only once or twice a year, and only for those of high enough status. The sessions involved sitting above a clay basin filled with steaming herbs, mugwort, ginseng, and sometimes dried orange peel, allowing the steam to rise and realign the internal harmony. This was called steaming, though no water touched the skin. The women sat with their robes raised, their faces blank, sometimes shivering from the heat, while maids fanned the steam upward. It lasted 15 to 20 minutes. Afterward, they were wrapped tightly in cloth and led back to their chambers without speaking. Whether it felt relieving or not didn't matter. It was part of the routine. On ordinary days, if a woman experienced itching, swelling, or discharge, she was told to change her sitting habits, to avoid cold stones, to sleep with a silk cushion between her knees, to drink more warm tea. She was not permitted to ask for medicine unless the condition became so obvious it could no longer be hidden, and even then, shame lingered. Modern gynecology would likely have a heart attack just reading this. But no one in the palace saw it that way. Silence meant modesty. Discomfort meant obedience. A woman who did not speak of her body was considered elegant. That expectation had weight. It pressed down heavier than the layers of clothing or the restrictions of rank. I often think about how that pressure must have felt. Not just physical, but emotional. To know something felt wrong, the itch, the sting, the smell, and yet be trained to ignore it. There is something profoundly sad about teaching a girl that caring for herself makes her less pure, that to wash is to damage, that to touch is to weaken. Over time, the discomfort becomes normal, expected, even praised. Some women tried quiet remedies. They sprinkled powdered camphor inside their undergarments. They placed dried herbs between folds of cloth, letting them rest near the skin. These efforts were small and mostly symbolic. The body was still left without proper cleaning, and the results were predictable. Infection spread quietly. Irritation turned into ulcers, and still, few spoke. Among lower-ranking women, the rules were not as strictly enforced. Some of them washed in secret, using water brought in at night. They crouched over basins in the dark, rinsing quickly, afraid of being seen. The risk of being punished for damaging their key was always present, but some chose comfort over compliance, at least in the shadows. Yet even that was not a guarantee. If a woman was discovered washing herself too often, or using herbal mixtures without approval, she could be accused of trying to make herself more appealing to forbidden lovers. The body was not hers to care for as she pleased. It belonged to the system, to the palace, to the emperor. Compared to today's access to feminine hygiene products, clean water, and medical care, the royal women of ancient China were left with little more than superstition and cloth. Their bodies carried not just the weight of expectation, but the consequences of neglect. And so they sat, legs together, back straight, robes heavy, doing nothing. Not because they didn't feel the need, but because they weren't allowed to act on it. There was no routine for daily care, no scheduled washing, no permission to cleanse, just a calendar with a red mark twice a year, and the quiet knowledge that until then, they had to endure. By the time they were granted another steaming session, the discomfort had often passed, or it had worsened into something no amount of herbs could undo. Either way, the response was the same: sit still, say nothing, obey. Other strange habits would surround this silence, habits that mask the signs rather than address the cause. From scented cloth stuffed between the thighs to rituals involving powders and incense, the palace had its ways of covering up what it refused to clean. By the time the royal women had finished avoiding water, folding damp cloth, and steaming quietly over herbal pots, there was still one more ritual waiting for them before they stepped out into the public corridors of the palace. The face had to be prepared, not gently or luxuriously, but firmly, with purpose. It had to appear bright, full, and smooth, no matter how the body felt underneath. This preparation involved powder, but not the kind most people imagine when they hear that word. Inside lacquered boxes tucked into carved wooden shelves, there were trays of finely ground substances, pale grey, off-white, and sometimes slightly greenish in tone. This powder was soft to the touch, but dense in smell. It clung to the fingers when pinched. Some of it was made from rice flour or crushed pearl, but in certain courts, particularly those in colder northern regions, another mixture was more common. It included dried moss scraped from the inner walls of shaded buildings and the powdered remains of small rodents. Not all mice were used, only those found dead naturally, not poisoned. The corpses were dried in shaded corners of the palace kitchens or storerooms, wrapped loosely in paper and left for several days until stiff and brittle. Afterward, they were crushed using a stone pestle until nothing remained but dust and fragments of bone. This was then passed through a fine mesh to remove larger pieces, What remained was an ash-coloured powder with a slightly sour scent. It was mixed with dried wall moss, which was scraped using dull blades and laid flat to air before grinding. Nothing says elegance like spreading crushed vermin across your cheeks before breakfast. The resulting powder was then combined with sesame oil to create a loose, sticky paste. This mixture could be stored in sealed clay pots or used fresh each morning. Women would dip a flat wooden spatula into the paste, spreading it carefully across the forehead, the sides of the nose, the chin, and under the eyes. It dried within minutes, forming a dull, pale surface that dulled redness and softened the appearance of lines. There was no perfume added. The scent of the paste was strong. Moss brought a musty note. The dried mouse powder added something sharper, slightly metallic, in summer, when the heat caused the mixture to loosen and melt along the jawline. The smell became stronger. Servants who helped apply the paste were trained not to react, to breathe through their mouths, to keep their faces blank. The purpose of the paste was not just cosmetic. It was believed to contain energy from both the earth and small creatures. Wool moss, in particular, was thought to draw moisture from the skin and balance the qi along the facial meridians. The rodent component was harder to explain. Some believed it was the spirit of survival captured in the powder. Others simply accepted that it worked. Faces looked smoother, skin flaked less. The Emperor noticed. Modern skincare uses glass bottles and luxury branding, but these women relied on walls and pests. There were no guarantees. Some women developed rashes, others broke out in red patches. But when one woman in the court gained favour after using the mixture, others followed. That was enough. Imitation replaced inquiry. No one questioned the ingredients as long as the face looked firm beneath candlelight. After the application, the women waited. The paste had to dry fully before they could dress. During this time, maids folded robes, set out shoes, and prepared hair ornaments. Movement was limited. Smiling too early would crack the layer across the cheeks. Blinking too quickly could cause it to flake. Silence was expected. Stillness was part of the process. When dry, a second layer might be added. This one was made from a finer powder, sometimes tinted with ash from burnt peachwood. It helped absorb oil and set the base. The result was a thick, pale mask that covered most imperfections. It also sealed in the smell, making it harder to notice throughout the day. Scarves and fans helped. Stronger perfumes were forbidden. That left the mixture to speak for itself. I often wonder how it felt to carry the smell of death while being praised for looking alive. The contradiction must have settled deep into the mind. Perhaps they stopped noticing. Perhaps they learned to associate the scent with success. Or maybe they simply endured, as they did with everything else. Once the face was complete, the hair was pinned up. Jewels, combs, and ribbons were added. But nothing drew more attention than the brightness of the face. A good layer meant good health. A smooth finish meant control. To let the natural skin show through was not seen as bravery. It was seen as a failure. The jars and trays were returned to their cabinets. The pestles were wiped clean with damp cloths. Crumbs of moss were brushed from the floor. Pieces of rodent bone were sometimes found in corners and quickly removed. There was no ceremony around it. Just another step in the morning. Another moment to act like everything was proper. But beneath that surface, something lingered. The mixture sank into pores. It hardened over time. It was difficult to remove completely, even with oils. Some women left faint stains on their pillows. Others developed permanent greyness around their hairlines. The price of a pale face was not temporary. It stayed. The palace required that every part of a woman's body be managed, covered, enhanced, or suppressed. Nothing was left alone, not even the skin. And in this way, the powder became both mask and message. It told the world that the woman had prepared herself, that she had used what was given without complaint to make herself presentable. There were other substances too, not just for the face but for the hair, the breath, even the armpits. Some of them were just as strange, others were worse, and like the powder, they were considered necessary for any woman who wanted to be remembered. Once their faces had been coated with powders made from crushed moss and dried rodents, and the day's routine had fully settled into motion, the royal women returned to their sleeping chambers. These rooms were more than places to rest. They were also considered spaces of ritual, spiritual alignment, and bodily preservation. The palace did not treat sleep as simply a pause in activity. Sleep was part of a woman's role in maintaining balance, beauty, and readiness. For that reason, even the air she breathed while lying down was carefully controlled. In many inner quarters, especially in the colder seasons, the doors and windows of a consort's chamber were covered completely. This was not done with silk drapery or woven bamboo screens. It was done using thick sheets of animal hide, deer skin, fox, chamois, and even weasel pelts were stretched and hung across entryways and window frames. These hides had not been fully tanned or cured. Some still retained patches of fur. Others gave off a sour smell from the fat and flesh not entirely removed. These hides were believed to retain heat better than cloth. More importantly, they were said to capture and hold masculine energy, or yang qi, within the room. Palace physicians insisted that after being with the emperor, a woman should not allow the room to ventilate too quickly. Letting cold air in was believed to weaken the connection between her body and the imperial presence. Therefore, the hides stayed in place through the night, sealing in every breath, every drop of warmth, and every particle of smell. Nothing creates a romantic atmosphere like sleeping inside a bag that smells like the back end of a butcher shop. The air inside these rooms quickly became dense. Without any flow, the mix of animal hide, sweat, dust, and herbal oils formed a smell that clung to the walls. The floor mats absorbed it. The bedding held onto it. Women who spent too much time in these rooms developed headaches, dizziness, and persistent nausea. They rarely connected it to the air. Instead, they were told their key was misaligned. Servants who entered the rooms to bring tea or fetch items were instructed to open the doors as little as possible. They held their breath, performed their tasks quickly, and left without speaking. Some learned to breathe through sleeves. Others dabbed herbal ointment beneath their nostrils before stepping in. These quiet adjustments were never acknowledged. Everyone understood that some spaces inside the palace were not meant to smell pleasant. They were meant to be sacred. Inside the rooms, the hides shifted in the night. As the temperature changed, the animal's skin would tighten or loosen. Sometimes it cracked. Other times, it let out a faint creaking sound. The noise was subtle but constant. Women lying awake under heavy quilts listened to it without reacting. The body adjusted to the smell eventually, but the mind never quite forgot what it was surrounded by. Compared to today's standard of fresh linens, air purifiers, and essential oils, these chambers were more like damp animal dens than royal retreats. The irony is that they were supposed to protect, to shield the woman from illness, from imbalance, from energy loss. Yet what they trapped instead were the very things that made the body weaker over time. Many women developed skin rashes from the constant exposure to decaying hide. Others experienced dry throats, burning eyes, and fatigue that never fully lifted. Physicians prescribed more steam, more teas, more rest. No one ever suggested removing the hides. That would mean rejecting a centuries-old tradition. That would suggest questioning the wisdom of court doctrine. Some tried to ease the effects. A few had layers of silk sewn behind the hides to reduce the smell. Others hung pouches of herbs along the walls. A few placed bowls of vinegar beneath their beds, hoping to absorb some of the fumes. These methods worked only slightly, and never for long. In the end, the hide was still there, warm, heavy, and alive in its strange way. I often picture these rooms late at night, a single lantern burning low. The air was so thick you could feel it on your skin. A woman lying motionless, hair still pinned up, breath shallow. It must have felt like sleeping inside something that had never truly died. There is a difference between silence and suffocation, and some chambers blurred the line completely. There were also practical consequences. The fur attracted insects. Moths burrowed into the soft parts. Beetles nested along the seams. Maids were instructed to brush the hides weekly with stiff brushes made from straw or pig bristles. This released clouds of dust and sometimes pieces of fur. The brushing had to be done quickly and always before sunrise. It was not allowed to interfere with a woman's appearance during the day. Despite these challenges, the hides remained in use throughout many dynasties. They were part of what made a woman's quarters feel complete. Removing them would be like removing part of her role. Even the most powerful consorts rarely refused them. The act of enduring was seen as a sign of dignity. Clean air was not part of the standard. Endurance was... I think there is something deeply revealing in how comfort was always the last consideration. What mattered was tradition, preservation, and appearance, even if that meant breathing in something that made you sick. The palace had its logic, and in that logic the body was something to be used, not protected. Not all coverings were made of hide. Some chambers used other materials, equally suffocating, and not every woman accepted these conditions quietly. There were other ways they tried to escape the smells and the headaches. Not by removing the source, but by masking it with something even stronger. After long nights spent inside rooms sealed with animal hides, where the air became heavy and foul, some women sought ways to rebalance their bodies. But rebalancing did not involve bathing or scrubbing or anything modern hygiene would suggest. Instead, it meant returning to smoking. In the belief system of the court, heat and steam were tools of purification. But the fuel for that heat came from unexpected places. Among the more private rituals of royal women was the practice of genital steaming. Unlike the herbal steamings done during ceremonial cleansing, this version was considered more potent. It was not arranged by court physicians, but passed down by elder concubines and attendants. The method involved burning dried animal dung beneath the body, and allowing the smoke to rise directly to the most sensitive parts. The dung used was carefully selected. Donkey dung and goat droppings were favoured. Both animals were believed to have properties that encouraged warmth and stability. The dung was dried for days in the sun, then crushed lightly and formed into small, flat cakes. These were stored in clay jars kept near the chamber or in the servant quarters. When the time came, a small brazier was lit in a quiet corner. The cakes were placed on the embers, releasing a dense, acrid smoke. A low wooden stool with a hole carved in the centre was brought out. The woman removed her lower garments, wrapped herself in thick cloth to trap the heat, and sat slowly on the stool. Beneath her, the smoke curled upward. She remained there for 10 to 15 minutes, eyes closed, breathing slowly, while the smell rose around her and into her clothes and skin. In terms of spa experiences, it ranked somewhere between medieval torture and a backyard trash fire, but it was done with full intention. The smoke was thought to kill hidden germs, dry out excess moisture, and keep the body warm deep within. This was especially emphasized during the winter or after menstruation. A cold womb, they said, was a dangerous thing. The room was filled with smoke. It did not smell clean. It smelled like burnt hair and earth and something much worse. The dung released oils and toxins that clung to every surface. Attendants were told to stay far back, but some had to assist in adjusting the stool or adding more dung. They turned their faces away, tied a cloth around their mouths, and never commented on the scent. The women who practiced this did not talk about it openly. It was done in quiet chambers behind heavy screens. The stool was stored behind curtains. The dung was wrapped in silk to hide its appearance. Only a few maids were trusted to prepare it. This secrecy gave it power. It also gave it protection from ridicule. Modern wellness routines talk endlessly about detoxing, but this version came with flies. Insects were drawn to the leftover ash. The stool absorbed the smell and had to be scraped with a dull knife after each session. Still, many continued. They believed in it. They trusted it. They did not question why their hair smelled of smoke for days or why their undergarments took on a yellow hue that would not wash out. The smell reached beyond the skin. It settled into the walls. The chamber carried it. Even the emperor's attendants sometimes noticed a shift in the air after visiting a favoured concubine's room. No one dared to ask. The scent was disguised with herbal sachets or layers of perfume applied to clothing. But beneath it, the burnt edge of something animal remained. Not every woman submitted to the practice. Some resisted. Some found reasons to leave the chamber early or told their maids they were ill. But avoiding it came with its own risks. Older women would whisper about fertility problems, about loss of favour, about strange illnesses cured only by smoke. A woman who refused was marked as delicate. A woman who endured was seen as strong. I find it difficult to imagine sitting still while breathing in the scent of burned dung rising into the body. But that is what was expected. There is something quietly terrifying about being told that the only way to stay healthy is to choke on something meant to be discarded, and yet it continued. The brazier was lit, the dung was burned, the body absorbed it. Some women tried to soften the experience. They added dried herbs to the dung, hoping to mask the smell. Lavender, mint, and orange peel. The herbs burned too quickly. The smoke still won. Others lined the stool with cloth or rubbed oil on their thighs to reduce irritation. These small adjustments made little difference. The real discomfort came from within. Over time, the stools cracked from the heat, the braziers rusted, the jars of dung became stale, but the practice was still passed on, quietly, without mention in official records. It was a woman's secret, handed from one generation to the next like a family recipe no one liked but everyone used. Compared to the perfumes and powders of the outer court, this was the hidden truth of palace hygiene, the part that no artist painted, the part no poet praised. It was earthy, uncomfortable, and always done behind closed doors, and it was only one part of the effort. What happened afterward was equally strange. The scent lingered on the body, and some women believed it had to be sealed into work, so they wrapped themselves tightly in thick robes and went to sleep still smelling of ash. But not all of them stayed in their rooms. Some were summoned, some were expected to appear fresh and glowing, even with the smoke still clinging to their skin. There were ways they dealt with that too. Rituals for the hair, for the armpits, for the breath. None of them is simple. None of them is clean. Once the body had absorbed the smoke of burned animal waste and the skin had been sealed in layers of cloth, there was still one final area left to manage before facing the public eye: the mouth. For women living in the innermost parts of the Imperial court, this was not only a matter of appearance, but of tradition and superstition. A sweet breath was tied to fortune. A coated tongue was tied to an imbalance. But despite its importance, oral hygiene did not follow the path of water and bristle. Instead, it relied on a simple piece of rotting wood. Inside lacquered boxes, sometimes wrapped in faded cloth, were small sticks made from aromatic trees, not fresh, not cut from healthy trunks. These sticks came from fallen branches or decaying trunks, often softened by rain and buried halfway into forest soil. They were gathered precisely because they were aged and had already been colonized by tiny organisms. The ideal stick was slightly soft, lightly cracked, and visibly speckled with fine boreholes. These sticks were chosen for their scent: sandalwood, camphor wood, and sometimes cypress. But their most prized feature was the life inside them. The hollow tunnels often carried insect eggs or tiny larvae, nearly invisible to the eye. It was believed that this invisible movement inside the stick infused it with vitality. The more it moved, the more energy it could offer. The wood was never dried completely. Moisture was preserved so it would soften quickly when chewed. Each morning, a woman would remove a stick from its wrapper and place the end in her mouth. She would chew slowly, letting the fibres separate into soft threads. The tip became brush-like, though irregular and coarse. It scratched at the surface of the tongue, moved along the teeth, and pushed aside any remaining food from the night before. It was less of a cleaning and more of a negotiation between your mouth and a chunk of compost. There was no rinsing afterward. The act of chewing was believed to not only clean the mouth, but also stimulate digestion and regulate breath. Saliva was to be swallowed. Spitting was frowned upon. The liquid created during this chewing was seen as beneficial. Some believed it carried herbal properties passed from the tree. Others valued the faint sweetness or bitterness it brought to the throat. There were no mirrors, no evaluation of gum health, no checking for decay. The sensation of friction was considered enough. If the tongue felt scraped and the teeth had been rubbed, the job was done. The stick was then either dried for reuse or burned discreetly to avoid attracting insects. Attendants carried small bundles of these sticks and would present them on request. Some women had preferences for certain trees, certain textures. Others used whatever was available. Modern dentistry, with its fluoride and sterile bristles, would collapse in horror at this practice. But inside the palace, it was accepted. The sticks were portable, disposable, and tied to ancient beliefs. They required no water, no mirror, and no privacy. And for many, they gave a sense of ritual that was more valuable than actual cleanliness. There were drawbacks, of course. The splinters are sometimes lodged in the gums. The larvae hatched occasionally, releasing a faint bitterness or soft crackle as the teeth crushed them. Some women experienced ulcers or swelling. A few suffered infections that went untreated until they reached the bone. These outcomes were rarely discussed. The stick was not blamed. The body was. I often think about the feeling of chewing something you know is alive, that each morning begins with the crunch of wet wood and the faint movement of things hidden inside. There is something deeply unsettling about having to bite through rot just to be considered fresh, and yet it continued, quietly, without question. For women with status, the sticks were chosen carefully. They were sometimes carved with names or tied with coloured thread. The wrappers were embroidered, but the wood inside was the same, moulded, soft, half decomposed. In summer, the bundles had to be aired out or they attracted beetles. In winter, they stiffened and had to be warmed by the fire before use. The smell after use was not pleasant. It clung to the breath. It is mixed with the residue from powders, pastes, and smoke. Women often kept small sachets of mint or orange peel in their sleeves, biting them discreetly when in company. The sweetness masked the decay, but only briefly. Some tried to improve the method. A few chewed cloves or rolled the sticks in ground herbs. Others boiled the sticks lightly before use, which killed the insects but also dulled the flavour. These variations were allowed, but not popular. The original method, with all its flaws, remained the standard. The wooden fibres were never discarded openly. They were collected and buried or burned with other waste. They were not meant to be seen. Just like so many parts of these women's lives, they were meant to vanish after use, leave no trace, be done quietly, then move on to the next task. Compared to the glossy smiles seen in portraits or court paintings, the reality behind them was far less polished. Underneath the powder and jewellery, behind the soft-spoken words, was a mouth that had spent the morning gnawing through rotting wood, and the care didn't stop there. If the mouth was prepared, so too was the scalp. But unlike the quiet chewing of sticks, the next practice was louder, messier, and far more invasive. It started at the roots and moved outward, pulling more than just hair. After the mouth had been scraped clean with worm-infested sticks, and the breath masked with bitter peel, attention shifted upward to the crown of the head. The hair, always visible, always judged, had to meet the impossible standards of palace life. Thick, black, shiny, smooth. It was not just a matter of beauty. It was a marker of health, of value, of discipline, and it came with a price. There were oils and pastes for everyday use, made from sesame or plum kernel. But once a week, sometimes more, another mixture was brought out, one that was rarely mentioned aloud, not even among women of equal rank. It came wrapped in linen, stored in clay, and carried with caution. Its main ingredient was fresh mouse blood, Mice were everywhere in the palace. Some were trapped, others caught by hand. Small ones were chosen for this purpose. They were believed to be younger, purer, and more effective. Their blood was collected as soon as they were killed, usually in the early morning when the body was still warm. The blood was then mixed with slices of raw ginger and left to sit for several hours until the liquid turned slightly cloudy. The smell was sharp and metallic, cut with the spicy heat of the root. The resulting liquid was strained through fine cloth and warmed gently over coals. Attendants used small wooden brushes or strips of rough linen to apply the mixture directly to the scalp. Hair had to be parted neatly, the skin pulled tight. The liquid dripped slowly down, soaking the roots, pooling at the neck, sometimes even staining the robe. If luxury smells like warm rodent and burning ginger, then the palace had more than enough to offer. The mixture caused immediate sensation, a tingling at first, then a slow burn. Some women felt it as heat spreading under the skin. Others described a sharp sting. The longer it stayed, the deeper the discomfort.